I want to talk about HR 2930, which is the Entrepreneur Access to Capital Act, and why it's important. And I apologize, I'm going to have my GPS talking to you in Japanese when it tells me to turn. So it may drive you crazy, or you may learn some Japanese. So I'm headed to a meeting. So I'm going to make this talk as I go to this meeting. Hopefully not crash. Ultimately, let me talk some background. There is something I'm calling the gilding Leviathan. The gilding Leviathan. What is the gilding Leviathan? Well, the gilding Leviathan is an event that's going to happen in the next 20 to 30 years. It's predicted to happen in about 30. I think it could happen maybe within 10. What it is that basically the amount of resources that we're consuming as a planet is pretty much doubling. It's like a doubling penny. So if you think of it as a tablecloth, as this is the planet's resources, okay? The amount of resources the planet has. And think of basically a threshold above it, meaning that based on growth, it can support so many doublings. After that, we're basically living on savings, on ecological savings. And you've probably heard of things called peak oil and other things, right? This all ties into that. So imagine doubling. So imagine that you have a tablecloth, and then imagine, a meter or a foot or whatever above that tablecloth is what the globe can sustain in the number of population, the people, and everything else. Now you may be wondering, how does this relate to 2930, the Global Entrepreneur Access to Capital Act? I'll talk about that. This may be a long talk, so enjoy it as I'm driving here. So as you double this tablecloth, you're actually showing, you're getting taller and taller, because as it doubles, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. Well, some research, this was done in 1970 by a gentleman, Matthews, I can't think it was David Matthews, PhD at MIT. And it was commissioned by an elite group called the Roman Club, right? It's a think tank in Switzerland. It's a think tank. Their goal is to figure out problems. Now, ultimately, this research was done. They knew this was, someone had the feeling like I have. I had this. I knew this was true. I just didn't know the research existed. And ultimately, until like last week, or this week actually, the week's not over. And I was like, wow, this fits in with everything. But ultimately, in 1970, this guy, Professor Matthews figured, you know what, this is going to change everything. They figured, they started talking to politicians. This is MIT, okay? Majorly funded, and 40 years later, understand nothing's been done. Their predictions has actually, it's the rate of increase is actually greater than what they predicted, and there's no media coverage or anything else. And what, there's a great the reason why I'm calling the gilding Leviathan is because of a TED Talk done this year at TED Global by Paul Gilding, right? And it's because of this talk I was like, wow, this is exactly what I knew was going to happen. And I just knew, right? I didn't have any empirical evidence. I just knew, right? I just knew this, it was just obvious to me, right? Everything, within my paradigm, I know this is happening, and this is my motivation for doing education using information technology, because education is the only way that it can be curtailed. And the thing is, Matthews even says that, you know, to bring about a new paradigm is going to take education. Well, we don't have a global education framework, right, to provide it. What I want to do with the e-singularity, and the e-singularity is the moment all education is free and accessible to all, we can bring that about. And ultimately, what happened was I started Eduet in 2001. Off and on, I didn't do anything with it for much for those early years, okay? And then in 2006, this paradigm came to my mind as realization. And basically, I realized that e-singularity, the e-singular platform, is pivotal for the survival of our species. Because education is the only way you're going to bring about a new consumer paradigm, right? Education. And when you have over, 5 billion people now who don't have access to that education, they're going to keep doing the same thing they're doing, right? Well, I couldn't get Eduet going, so ultimately I launched something called Found-Ups, and Found-Ups became the Open Startup. And the Open Startup, and this is the last 2 years. 2 years ago I did this because I realized I couldn't get this massive project going. I needed a hammer, I needed a tool, I needed something to help me bring this to pass. And I started looking at the startup, figuring out how to define it, what are the pieces, what are the problems, and realized that there's 3 systemic bottlenecks that is stopping global innovation. Those systemic bottlenecks are as follows: talent, funding, and developing. Now, I've done talks on those, so I'm not going to, but funding is a core component to innovation. And what makes Silicon Valley unique to the globe, and it was an article that I just read yesterday, is that Silicon Valley is the only place where the maxim success equals money plus talent plus the right market conditions. Because in Silicon Valley, basically, success equals access to talent. Talent meaning VCs and other folks, right? And the network, the VC network and the talent network in Silicon Valley is unique to any place in the world. And I can't remember, but he talks about it. So the problem is everywhere else, you need to have loans, you need to have access to people with money to bring about innovation. And as I've talked about before, less than 2.5% of the global population are innovators. And innovators are a subset of entrepreneurs. And then within the subset of innovators, there's probably called social capitalists or social innovators, right? They're a subset of the innovators. And in another article that I read, it talks about the problem is that SOCAP is having a really rough time, hard time finding funding. Well, the reason for that is that most innovation is, most SOCAP is at the what I call innovation stage. Now, I had to take a step back now and explain to you what a startup is, because you don't know. So let me explain to you what a startup, or at least explain the startup in ways that will make more sense to you. A startup is broken up into 3 stages. Those 3 stages are as follows. There's the innovation stage. Think of the innovation stage as the pre-seed. So pre-seed, I've got this idea on how to make the world a better place. I have this idea how to save humanity. I have this idea on how to do X, Y, Z, all right? You are at innovation. You don't have any funding, or you have less than 100,000 in funding, and ultimately you have no what's known as seed investors or angel investors, and you may or may not have a business plan. Depends, right? There's different levels of innovation stage. The second stage of a startup is what's known as the early stage, right? The early stage of a startup is what I refer to as the seed stage. The seed stage meaning this: it's early. You're incorporated. You have a vehicle. You know, you have seed investors. You have some money. You have a product, or you know, and you have customers, niche customers. And then finally, there's the late stage startup, or I call the seeded startup. Let me take a step back. I forgot one important point. The early stage actually has between 100,000 to 2 million in either net revenue or investments. The reason why I use net revenue is because you can take net revenue and invest it back into your startup, and it becomes, you know, an investment vehicle. So if you paid for everything and you got money left over, you can take that money and improve on what you have. So ultimately, the final stage is the late stage, and the late stage is what I call the seeded stage, which is over 2 million in net revenue or investments. At this stage, you have the VC and the institutions come in, and it's late, okay? And you can even say there's the next stage, which is the laggard, right? Which are the institutions that come in. If you want to break the VCs and institutional investors from, you know, late and laggard, the laggards are the institutions. They're the big companies that finally get convinced to put money into your idea, and that's where they raise 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, right? That's when they really ramp it up in the laggard stage of the startup, right? The laggards come in, laggard investors. You know, the law of diffusion of innovation also applies to the law of diffusion of funding and innovation, something I've come up with. And the law of diffusion of funding and innovation basically states that, you know, less than 2.5% of global investors are going to invest at the innovation stage. 16% will invest at the early stage. 35% will invest at the late stage. Another 35% will invest in actually I missed it, late in the early adapter. Was it early majority? Okay, I missed it. So the early, there's two stages. There's early, and then there's early majority, right? Early minority and majority. So that early stage makes up 65% of investors. You got to think of that bell. You've probably seen The Gap, and should have not come over. So ultimately, they call it the chasm. The chasm. You see that? It's called. It's what's it called? It's the shape. I can't think of the math name for it, but so those are the stages. So getting back to the original talk, HR 2930 is going to bring around something called micro seed investing. But let's talk about the current problems that we're facing and what HR 2930 is going to help alleviate and transform, right? And understand most Western markets and even many Asian markets basically follow the SEC requirements, right? They have copied the SEC. America is a leader in setting market trends and everything else. So, you know, if Americans are drinking and watching Coca-Cola, so will Indians, right? So will the Chinese. So this pop culture, and this pop culture extends into deep culture, which is policies and everything else. You know, you need a visa for India because Indians need a visa for America, right? If we threw away the visa requirement for India, they would throw away the visa requirement for Americans. You know, what America does dictates policy, and there's plenty of historical evidence on this. You know, and this shouldn't be disputed or argued. Now, ultimately, the SEC law is law that stems back to 1933. So what was in 1933? There was no internet. There was the idea of a collaborative framework, right? Which we have. Open source is collaborative frameworks. Doesn't exist. Twitter and all the different things didn't exist. And ultimately, you know, they are, you know, the law's built on a paradigm that is obsolete. Can you imagine running a company based on the, you know, frameworks from the 1930s? Well, that's what we're doing with the capital markets, right? And the reason why this framework exists, let's just, you know, is control. If you control who can invest, you can control who makes the money, right? IPOs, whoever can get into an IPO before the IPO launches is going to win, right? Very rarely does an IPO start at, you know, at $10 and goes down to $1. I mean, maybe it's happened once in a while, but very, very rare. Nearly every time, IPOs will go up in value. As we've seen, LinkedIn IPO, give you an example, was set at $25 and it went to over $100, right? LinkedIn. You know, Facebook IPO is coming up. I don't know when it is or if it happened, but that's, you know, that's projected to be massive. So, all right, so what does HR 2930 do? Why is it important? Well, what HR 2930 does, and it's Patrick McHenry's bill that he pioneered, and let's talk about, before I talk about the specifics, I really see the bill as an Occupy Wall Street win. It's an Occupy Wall Street win that they're trying to take back. Understand, the IPO startups, the big winners for that is Wall Street. So what happened was the Occupy movement was happening in October, and everyone was up in arms, everyone was sensitive, everyone wants to do something. Patrick McHenry, his timing for this bill was very fortuitous. And ultimately, the bill passed with 96% support, 99%. Only 4 percentage points to 99%. You could call this it's a 99% win. It's an open. Think of it as Occupy startup win. It's an Occupy Wall Street win. It's a tremendous win. So the bill passed, and I've made talks saying, you know what? Ain't gonna fly in the Senate. You can watch my talks on FoundUps TV. Because here's the problem. The Senate, number one, there's no one up for re-election in the Senate. Number two, the Senate is the representative arm of who? Of private equity, okay? Senators represent the private club. And basically, the folks that keep senators in powers, the folks that, you know, meet with them and everything else and whispers in their ears, has a lot to lose with HR 2930. Because ultimately, it potentially opens up a Pandora's box. They don't really know what will happen, but there's been a lot of talk about it, and significant insiders have written that, you know what, if this bill passes, it will be the death of angels, right? Now, if you watch my talk, I talk about what the open startup and basically eliminating the whole seed stage, right? So the startup becomes the pre-seed to launch, right? There is no middle stage. Well, the simple fact is, why I can do that is that HR 2930 will allow, and this is what the bill will do, us to raise up to $10,000, right? Within 1 year or 2 years, 1 year I think. For a start, you have 12 months or 24 months. I don't know if it's 2 years or 1 year, right? For capital for campaigns, and ultimately, you can raise up to $2 million. Remember that I told you that the late stage is up to $2 million, right? The late stage, and or you get the seeded, right? The seeded startup starts at $2 million. And ultimately, so one thing is you can raise up to $10,000, and there, you know, so the second thing what it does is removes this $499 investor cap. Right now, you can only have 499 investors in your startup, right? So you can never say, hey, I'm going to give equity to 499 people. That's it. You can invest. That's all you can have until you become a public company in a privately held company. Once you become public, you do an IPO, that barrier lifts, okay? So the 499 cap lifts. The other thing is you have all these state requirements that hinder you because you have to pay fees. So for every place that you want to raise money from, you have to pay fees there. And ultimately, what that means is you're at, you know, it becomes extremely expensive. You know, to do an SEC private offering through a Reg D, it's going to cost you about $35,000, $20,000 to $35,000 in legal fees, right? You have to hire attorneys, you got to get everything right, you got to get all the paperwork, you have every deal needs to be done. And the other thing is you can only raise up to $2 million on that, or that $1 million on that Reg D, right? Reg D only allows you to raise $1 million. So actually the great thing about the HR 2930, Patrick McHenry's bill, is it allows you to raise up to $2 million. There may be a caveat for $2 million, I think, where you have to have an audit or something else. But so that's why this bill is so important, because all of a sudden you can have anyone in the world investing in your startup, you know, and obviously, you know, you're like, well, you know, you heard all these guys stealing billions. We're not talking about billions of dollars. And, you know, oh, the $10,000 is actually 10,000 or 10% of your gross income, right? That's it, your cap. So whatever your gross income is, only 10%, to a max of 1,000. So, you know, to me that's a pretty safe. You can put 10%. There is no limits to how much money you can put in a lottery. There's no limits to how much money you can spend in Vegas or on a holiday or anything else. And ultimately, or buying gold. I mean, gold scams and all there. And also we've seen the, you know, the derivative scam that Wall Street pulled on us. All these investment banks pulled this derivative scam, destroyed the American dream, robbed homes and everything else of the American people. You know, and you know, and they're worried about the majority. Now, so HR 2930 is going to allow for this new paradigm. Now, what I've done is I've been thinking about HR 2930. Well, it wasn't, you know, I knew crowdfunding is going to come. How would it work? How would the gamification of it and everything else? And ultimately, you know, I've been working on this solution for 2 years, and that solution is the Open Startup Wiki, and what drives it is the Open Startup Engine, which is another name for the Open Incubator Framework, OIF. But it's just trying to simplify. You've got the wiki, you've got the engine, you know, how do these things work together, and you know, so that's it. So I hope you enjoyed this long. I know it's kind of long, 23 minutes. But it should provide you with a good understanding of kind of why this is important. So thanks.